Hey quilters, this is Sarah from Snowball Stitching, and I've got some stuff here for a quilt that I'm working on. And so I'm going to show you, we're going to use snowballs for this quilt, so I'm going to show you a little demo on snowballing your quilt blocks. So I've got several of these already marked, and when you're going to snowball your quilt, the first thing you need to do is mark your lines on your small snowballs. So let me just move some stuff out of the way. You can see I've got several of these marked already. I'm going to show you a few ways that you can mark these. All right, so the first way to mark these is you can get your ruler and a pencil. If you're worried about the mark showing through, you can always use a washable pencil or a pen that you trust. And you're going to line your ruler up with the corners and make a line across those two corners. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about this line. So I don't have my pencil. I have my pencil laid down here, and I'm just going to watch this. You can see how that moves, that square around, distorts the shape. And that's because you're drawing along the bias of the fabric. And what that means is that fabric is woven horizontally and vertically. So if you cut that fabric horizontally and vertically, there's not any extra stretch on the edges. But let's say you cut that fabric on the diagonal, you're not cutting on the grain, so there's going to be a whole lot more stretch there. So it's kind of the same thing with drawing on the bias, is that tends to move around and distort the shape. So when you line that up with the corners, I'm going to show you kind of a way that you can keep that from happening. So what we're going to do is we're going to start in the center and draw out. So press your thumb in the center and your fingers close to the edge and put a little extra pressure there while you draw. That's going to hold that still. And then to do the other side, fingers in the center, thumb towards that corner, and draw to the other edge. And that's going to give you a nice diagonal line as a guide for where to sew. Now let me show you another way that you can mark that, also using your ruler. You're going to line that diagonal line on your ruler up with an edge of your fabric, and that corner up with the corner of your square. So when you do that, once you get that all lined up, this corner should be in line with this top corner, and this side should be in line with this other corner. And you're going to do the same thing as far as applying pressure. So you're going to mark from the inside out and again from the inside out. So hold pressure in the middle and to the corner, then move down to the other side and hold pressure in the middle and to the other corner. And that just keeps your fabric in place while you draw that line. And one more way that you can mark your diagonal for sewing, and this way does not require marking, so if you don't like to make markings, you could use it, but you have to be pretty careful. So you're going to fold this square diagonally, wrong sides together. You'll line up the corners, and you have to be pretty careful with this, because for that same reason, when you're marking on the diagonal, if you do it this way, you can also easily distort along that diagonal. So be really careful, and you can either use your iron, and if you use your iron, you want to press, hold pressure, not iron to distort the shape. But I'm finger pressing here, and I'm being really careful that I'm just pressing down and I'm not pulling across there, because that will distort the shape of your block. And then once you've done that, when you open it up, you have your crease line that you can use as a guide to sew right along that crease. So whichever marking method works best for you. And now that the blocks, once the blocks are all marked, you can move on to the next step. Okay, so our next step is going to be to stack these squares that we marked right sides together with our other block here. And for this particular pattern, we are going to snowball opposite corners of the blocks. So I've got my cutting mat turned over to the blue side so that you can see it better. And let me just kind of show you what we're going to do. So you'll stack these corners right sides together. And let's just kind of come in a little bit, zoom in. So you see that I've got my line that I marked going from side to side on that block. So if I have it this way and try to sew along that line, that's not going to work. So you want to make sure that the line that you drew, or marked however you marked it, is going from side to side. And then you will sew either along that line or a hair off. And that's a little bit of debate as far as, do you sew right along that line or a hair off? And that's really going to depend on you. So the reason I say that is that if you're using super thick thread, you may want to sew just a hair to the outside of that line. So a hair to the outside would mean like closer to this outside corner of your block. And the reason I say that is because if you're really using really thick thread, when you fold this over later, then it may not be as close to in line with the edges of this background square as you want it to be. If you sew to the inside of this drawn line, you're a whole lot less likely to have that fold out really accurately. If you sew right along that line, depending on what thread you use, it may end up perfect, or it may be just a little bit off. So what I would suggest doing is get like a few practice squares that you're not going to use in your quilt and try it. Get the thread that you typically piece with and try it to see which one gives you the most accurate results. Now, I'm not going to lie. If you accidentally sew to the inside, or you accidentally sew right along that line when you wanted to sew just a hair to the outside, it's probably not going to make that much difference and probably still be easily fudgeable for you, so that when you sew those squares together, your quilt can still look nice. So, you know, there's a lot of debate over sewing straight along that line versus sewing to the hair to the outside. But, you know, that's not something I would rip stitches out over. So, on to this. When we sew across this line, you want to make it so that this stays in place for you. And so what I do is get a little glue, and this is just a washable glue stick that I got off of Amazon. You can also use the Elmer's purple disappearing school glue sticks, which I use all the time. They're great. So I'm going to put a little glue right along on the other side of this fabric and right along that spot where I'll end up having to sew. So right along where that line would be drawn, and also to the outside to secure that. And that's just going to make it so that when I'm sewing, that glue holds that down. And since you are sewing over the bias, that glue will hold that down for you and make it to where that bias doesn't start distorting. And so for this one, this particular pattern will end up snowballing opposite corners. So we're going to lay those down. Sew on the opposite side, or glue on the opposite side over where that line would be. And then also a little glue in the outside corners. I wouldn't glue the inside corners. A little glue on the outside corners just to hold those down for you. And then we'll sew along those. Now, if you are worried about later when you're done with this block and you press it, if you're worried about that glue getting on your iron, I do have a reel on Instagram where I show you an easy method for cleaning your iron. So I'll link that in the description. So now, once we have those face down and glued down in place for us, it's time to go to the sewing machine and sew. Okay, so now that we have all of our squares sewn on, I will show you what you need to do next to get that snowball effect. So these squares were sewn right sides together with this background square like we talked about. And then what we will end up doing is we will cut a seam allowance to the outside of the stitch line. The stitch line is right here, so we'll cut a seam allowance to the outside of the stitch line, and then we'll end up flipping that over like that for the snowball effect. So I'm going to show you on one at a time first, just so you get the gist of it, and then I'll show you how to do a bunch of them at once. So we have got I've got my 18 by 24 cutting mat right here, and you'll see why we're using that in a minute. I've got rotary cutter and a 12.5 inch by 12.5 inch square ruler, and you can use whatever size as long as it is big enough to go all the way across this stitch line. All right, so gonna move my mat around just a little bit here, and we're going to cut our seam allowance to the outside of the stitch line that's right here. And since we already put our stitch line on exactly where we want it to go, we do not have to have an exact 1/4 inch seam allowance. We can be a little generous with it, and that's going to help for what we're going to do next. But you will use the lines on your ruler, and if you want to do, I'm going to do a 3/8 inch seam allowance on this, and I'm going to align that 3/8 inch marks up with my stitch line here. And we'll just discard this little triangle to the side. And then we're going to flip our mat around and do the same thing on the other one. So stitch line right here, and we're going to do a seam allowance to the outside. So I'm going to line the 3/8 inch marks up with that stitch line. And cut it, and that gives us a generous seam allowance, which does not matter that it's not an exact 1/4 inch seam allowance, because we're using that stitch line to sew exactly where we want to. So the size of the seam allowance with this block doesn't really matter. So then once you're done with that, you can turn these corners out and press them, and that gives the snowball effect. So now I'm going to show you a technique for cutting a bunch of these at the same time. Kind of speed up your cuts. And for that, I think I'll just grab my 6 by 24 ruler on that one. So you're going to line this up on your 18 by 24 cutting mat, and we're going to start by lining these corners. So the corners of the blocks that we put face down against the background, we're going to line those corners up with a line marker. So for this one, I'm just using that 12 inch line, and I'm going to line each corner up with the 12 inch line. And then after I get those corners lined up, I'm going to move this over so that my stitch line is lined up with one of the vertical lines. So I've got my stitch line lined up with this line right here. And once you get that, you're going to grab another one of these, and you're going to line the corners of this one. So that's the corners that have the blocks face down on them. I'm going to line that one up with the 11 inch line, and I'm going to line this stitch line here up with that stitch line on the top and up with the line here on the bottom. And the reason that we're bothering to line these corners up too, and this only works on a square. The corners wouldn't really help you if you were using a rectangle, but for a square snowball, the corners will help you. And if you've only got one side of your block snowballed, then it doesn't really matter. You can just line the stitch lines up with the line. But we are going ahead and lining these corners up too, so that once we do one side, we can flip that around without moving it and do the other side. So I'm just going to keep doing that. Line those up just like that. And we'll just keep on going with that. Until we get a bunch of them lined up. And you want to just, do as many as you can while still being able to fit it on your mat. So I've got these corners lined up with the same horizontal line, and I've got this stitch line at the top lined up with the other stitch lines, and at the bottom I've got it lined up with that same vertical line. And how many of them you can do is just going to depend on the size of your blocks and the size of your cutting mat. I would stick with an 18 by 24 cutting mat though, because you can really work that to your advantage, and you'll see that pretty soon. So again, lining this stitch line up with this stitch line here, and the bottom of the stitch line, I'm lining it up with this line marker. For this one, I've got them all lined up with the 14.5-inch line marker. So you'll just make sure that they're all lined up with the same one. And I'm going to line these corners up with a horizontal line marker. And that's going to just make it so that this line should already be lined up nicely for you when you go to cut it. So I'm going to grab a ruler. Right here I've got a 6 by 24 ruler, but just use whatever ruler you have, as long as it will go across all of those blocks that you have lined up. So this right here is a good time for when that little bit of wiggle room, like maybe cutting that 3/8 inch seam allowance instead of 1/4 inch, would work well for you. Because if you don't have these lined up, 1000% perfect, then that 3/8 inch is going to give you a little wiggle room with that, so that you don't end up with one seam that's just not big enough to do what you need to do. So I'm lining the 3/8 inch marks up with these stitch lines. And so we're going to just cut through all these, and you'll want to make sure that your blade is nice and sharp, because you will be, once you're in the middle here, you're going to be cutting through a lot of layers. All right, so that's got all of those. Now we're going to keep that where it is, not going to move the fabric and have to realign it. We're just going to keep that where it is and swap our mat around so that we don't have to reline these up. Now, depending on what size blocks you're snowballing, if you have snowballs on both sides, this other line may not end up being, like these stitch lines on this other side, may not end up lining up perfectly with one of your vertical lines. So since we lined these corners up with a horizontal line, that should make it so that with this side lined up with a line and these corners lined up with one of the horizontal lines, that should make it so that this stitch line is at least nice and straight for us. So we're going to take our ruler again. I'm going to just give myself a little wiggle room, and I'm going to cut a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So since we sewed that stitch line exactly where we want it, the seam allowance does not have to be exactly 1/4 inch. So I'm going to line that 3/8 inch line up, and that just gives me a little wiggle room for in case these stitch lines were not all lined up perfectly straight with each other. Then that way, if one of the seam allowances is a little smaller, it's still going to be plenty big enough to do what we need to do. So I'm just lining the 3/8 inch lines all up and down this ruler, up as close to these stitch lines as I can. And then I'm going to cut all of that off. So we have all of these snowballs all ready for us to press. And I am using these for a new cut loose press pattern. So that's going to be a pattern that's only going to cost $3.99. So I am using these for a new cut loose press pattern. So stay tuned for the video on that. And so now you can just press these however you want to, and you get that nice look of there being those triangles on the outside without having to worry about cutting this weird shaped piece like that and then cutting small triangles and trying to sew that on. And by using our 18 by 24 inch cutting mat, we're able to work that to our advantage and speed things up for us a lot. So I hope this helped. And once that cut loose press pattern is available, I'll come back and link that in the description. And let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.